I am Nina Granqvist. I am Associate Professor of Management at Aalto University, School of Business in Finland. And my research addresses how new ideas and technologies move from margins to mainstream. So I look at the kind of microsocial dynamics of how new meanings are created among people working in different groups, different communities, how these meanings are contested and how they might become more widely shared. And there are multiple different ways to do that, many different literatures to explore those. So I've been looking at institutional theory and institutional work, then processes of categories, so categorization, and then looking at particular dynamics such as social symbolic work, which I quite much like as a construct, and temporality and others. So depending on the phenomena, I try to mobilize the theories that help best to explain whatever I observe. And I like to work with big data sets, collected like through interviews, ethnography, archival materials, so whatever materials are available, and then analyze and identify the patterns from therein, and then develop explanations for what we perceive, driven by the data, and then mobilizing the theories that we need to do that. So an inductive approach. So that's me briefly. I think this really goes back to my prior career. I was briefly a consultant during the so-called mobile internet hype, and I was working in a center of excellence for mobile internet solutions for Accenture, or Andersen Consulting at the time, and we were developing applications and products for markets that didn't exist, for consumers that didn't know that they would ever even want any of those products, for devices that weren't there, for the bandwidths in the network that weren't existing. And there was still a lot of excitement and hype around it. And I came to see this decoupling between the actual material development of technologies and then the level of speech, the narratives. So then from there onwards, I've been wanting to understand the decoupling between the language and the actual materiality of a particular field. And the paper that I'm presenting today is an explanation that derives from all these experiences from that professional background, but also from my research on nanotechnology and some foods, food trends, even solar technologies. So we can see this discrepancy between the way that people talk about something and the way that it really is. And then the hypes, to me, are narrative constructions that are disseminated by the media, and then this is something that I want to explain. So me and Eero Vaara have been developing this paper to explain this particular aspect of category emergence. So it's not a full explanation, but it's one element that is kind of missing that we want to introduce. There are many different ways that we use time-related arguments, time-related conceptions to justify change, for example. So the paper by myself and Robin Gustafsson, Temporal Institutional Work, we explain those dynamics and we kind of find that you cannot get the change going unless you have temporal arguments that are behind it. So you have to say that we have to engage in the change now, and how do you define the now? So you have to develop the window of opportunity. So the window opportunity refers to not something that is pre-existing and out there. It's rather a strategic construct that is articulated by those who are participating in the field. And they are saying that due to these certain situations that's happening elsewhere, and due to the things that we see observing happening now, then this is now the moment to do this change. If we don't do it now, then it will be too late. Also the sense of urgency relates to that. So there are many things that we need to do, but why should we do this change project? Well, it relates to the understandings that it's urgent, so we have to do something now. And then the sense of urgency explains why we engage with certain actions at a given time. And urgency, again, is a temporal construct. So something is more, has temporal priority to something else. So you're kind of creating these temporal hierarchies. And that's another interesting aspect of it. And I think the third element is the inevitability. So it's going to happen anyway, so we have to engage with that. And making something perceived inevitable is a very strong way to motivate action around that. Again, so all these three elements relate strongly to how we can get change projects going. And if you look at any change project that has more like someone orchestrating or trying to get it going, like many political change projects, you can see these elements present. The window of opportunity, urgency, and inevitability. They are often visible. I think that ethnography is really a way that you can look at time unfolding, so how certain temporal norms come into being. So, for example, if you are working in a high-tech industry, what kind of norms are impacting your daily work? So how do you structure your day? How do you synchronize your activities? What rhythms you are experiencing and how do they clash with each other? Observation is a really good way to trace all that. That's definitely one thing. And I think another thing that could be are a sort of, all the usual methods are great, interviews, so I'm more a qualitative scholar, so I talk from that perspective. But I think some things like diary method could be something, so you keep notes, or video ethnography, which is another very challenging, very exciting methodology that's being developed currently. So I think there are many ways to look into these. And also if you want to look at the more broader societal level dynamics, you also need to have more like data that is looking at the policy cycles and how those may create like eras or periods for action. So there are multiple levels at play, and then for each level a particular methodology might be more suited. When I look at the emerging fields, I see very different things. When I look at the nanotechnology field, I see an object that nobody really understands what it is. Nobody really understands what kind of products are belonging to that category, who are the key players. There are no clear hierarchies between the players in the markets because the markets don't exist. So from that perspective, this stability is not there. So everything is evolving, everything is developing, everything is dynamic in the way that there are many different parties who are claiming that certain things are nanotechnology and they belong to that category. They are justifying why that might be the case. And the challenge is that those who are justifying the claims, so assessing the claims, they might not have first-hand understanding of the technology. So they are maybe unable to justify whether the claims are right or wrong, or how the nanotechnology should look like. I mean, it's even ridiculous to say that it should look like anything because it's a very dispersed area. But all this tentative categorization that we see in that case makes it very clear that when the categories are formed, all these labels and all these identities, roles, actor roles, they are fluid and they are being construed in this setting by those who are participating in the field. And if we think about established categories, even though we perceive this stability, it is not really real. I mean, there's a gradual change For example, in the prototype of the car, we can see maybe in 5 years that the car will look a bit different. It can become more like a pod that's built around the human who is inside the pod. So the design principle is not anymore so much to accommodate the engine and all the parts that relate to the engine, but it's that you put the people in the pod and then you design the technology around it. So we can see that even that category would be changing, which we consider as something quite stable. So I do believe that the dynamism that those who look at category emergence is also visible in other categories, but it's just in a much sort of subtle way over a longer period in more minute changes. So I've been looking at multiple different settings empirically, and I can see certain like universal things happening across very different settings. So even in cultural industries, you might have similar things that you would have in science-based industries. And so let me explain what I mean. I think they always start with some kind of preliminary ideas that come from certain fringe actors. Because they are fringe because it doesn't exist as a category yet. I think social movement dynamics, the literature that it explicates, works for many of the categories that I've been observing. So if I look at, for example, nanotechnology, the early protagonists were these futurists, and they tried to mobilize certain very esoteric ideas about self-replicating machines and all these things. And this became very well accepted in the cyberpunk science fiction. And from there, science policy people were impacted by that, these approaches and understandings of nanotechnology. And the scientists who have been working with the hard science for, let's say, 40 years, in the sort of nano-size scale phenomena or in different areas, then they were impacted by this sort of popular cultural excitement around nanotechnology. So there was a very interesting dynamic of how the meanings kind of go and who becomes impacted. And I think that we can see this is a similar thing for all the fields, that there can be multiple different sources for where the new ideas come from and how they become mainstreamed. But the key thing is that you somehow have to make them resonant for wider audiences. And if we talk about like science-based fields, then we can see the big role of popular culture and science fiction in mobilizing ideas. So we all might have ideas of space elevators, for example. This is something that some of these big companies are actually developing. So you could have some kind of a space elevator made out of these particular carbon materials, and you could take some stuff to the orbits. I don't know how real that is, but they are actually looking into these conceptions. The things to consider are what is my style of doing research? So what kind of research do I like to do? What kind of topics truly inspire me? Because that gives a let's say longer term excitement and engagement with a career if we are working with phenomena that you are really interested in anyway. So that's very important, to study things that you find very interesting. And another thing is talk with people, engage with others a lot, and this is sometimes developing a paper is a community effort, especially when you are a young scholar, but also in the later stage. So engage and talk with your ideas, and certain conversations can save you half a year of reading, you know, because someone tells you that, hey, it's been studied, but there's another perspective, and here are the key literature on that, so look into those. So be engaged with the community, and I think that there's an element of being focused on doing and finalizing the papers. So if you start something, then consider on how you're going to finish it. And if you don't think you will want to finish something, then don't start it in the first place. So make choices in what you do. And maybe the final thing is to say yes to things. When people ask you to comment on the work, you should say yes, I'm happy to read your work, to a limit. You know, you shouldn't become burdened by that, but you should do that service. If someone asks you to become a reviewer for the journal or participate in organizing an event, you should do it, because it's the way that you start to engage with other scholars, and then you get a bit of a name when you are being visible and seen in these areas.